May I take this opportunity to welcome our speaker for today, the Rev'd Dr. Joshua Samuel, who will be speaking to us about a theology of mission in the context of rising religious nationalisms. As somebody poignantly put it many years ago, we live in a context where there seems to be enough religion to make us hate one another, but not enough religion to make us love one another. And that is particularly true in a context of virulent religious nationalisms that have taken violent expressions in many parts of the world. In such a context, what would a theology of mission look like? So without much further ado, let me invite our speaker for today, the Reverend Dr. Joshua Samuel, to share his thoughts, after which we'll open ourselves up to a time of conversation. Over to you, Joshua.
It's not a letdown, but I also assured Dr. Peniel that the good thing is that it can always get, it's only get better. So it's always good to start with something that's, low profile and less exciting, I guess. So thanks again for this opportunity. I unfortunately I could not prepare a PowerPoint, but I hope you can follow me, and I'll try to be as clear as possible, the best I can. And I also wanted to start with with some apologies and clarifications. Actually, the apologies that I'm not feeling too well, so my voice might be a bit hoarse, and also if you see me taking a couple of seconds to blow my nose or cough away, please do excuse me. And hopefully it won't be too bad, but I'll do the best I can. And in terms of clarifications, just a few things. First, while nationalism in general is an issue that is the cause of much concern, in this particular paper, I want to focus mainly on religious nationalism, particularly in the Indian context, but also in conversation with the North American context, North American religious politics, religious political context. Second, in spite of the differences, because they overlap with each other and support each other, I'm going to use the words fundamentalism and nationalism almost synonymously in this paper. So where there are obvious differences, I would love to hear from you and discuss with you. Third, as we know, the effects of religious nationalism are not experienced uniformly across the world. The power of religious nationalism depends on one's position within the social and political structures. So keeping this in mind, I focus particularly on the state of or rather a community of communities, I should say, the status of Dalits and Christian Dalits in relation to Hindu fundamentalism and nationalism in the Indian context and in the global context, actually. Dalits, as I guess I'm sure all of you may know, are formerly untouchable communities in India who continue to experience discrimination through the caste system. So the purpose of this paper is to propose a theology of mission that speaks from the perspective of grassroots communities, from oppressed communities. So I've kind of tweaked my title a little bit, and I also noticed that probably there might be two different titles going around, not two different actually, but two interrelated titles going around maybe, and partly because of my mistake. But the title for my paper would be Envisioning a Sacramental Theology of Mission in the Age of Rising Religious Nationalisms. Envisioning a Sacramental Theology of Mission in the Age of Rising Religious Nationalisms. So broadly speaking, my paper will have two parts. The first part is more of a background on Hindu fundamentalism and nationalism in relation to Dalits, while the second part deals more with mission, directly with mission and theology of mission. I begin the paper with a brief overview of religious nationalism in India, but in relation to Christian nationalism in the North American context. I then turn to how religious fundamentalism is manifested among Dalits and the complexities it involves in a global context. In the third part of the paper, I shall consider some of the historical problems within Christian mission, but also noting that mission continues to be a mandatory aspect of Christian life. And finally, I shall tease out, I shall point out that learning from the margins, such as Dalit Christianity, could help us to move towards a more sensitive, dialogical, and sacramental understanding of mission. So, moving on to the problem of religious fundamentalism and nationalism. It is well known now that the roots of Indian nationalism and fundamentalism had much to do with colonialism and the missionary enterprise, or as some claim, perhaps even earlier, to the Mughal invasion and the Mughal Empire. Feeling threatened by the increasing influence of Islam and Christianity, it is not surprising that some Hindus felt the need to reclaim the land for their own religious community. Cornered by Christian evangelicalism and expressions of Christian fundamentalism, some Hindus developed a more closed and aggressive idea of Hinduism. And those Indians who had strayed to other religions have to return home, according to this ideology, to Hinduism. As Ankur Barua observes, conversions to other religions are seen as attempts to denationalize the natives. There is much that has been written on this, but I'm more interested to see how Hindu nationalism plays out in a globalized world. I want to highlight just 4 instances where Hindu and Christian nationalism engage with each other based on my work with Indians and Indian Christian communities in India and in the United States. Let me begin with the fact that Hindu nationalism is now a global phenomenon. For instance, much of the funding support for Hindu nationalist groups comes from the United States. More often, these are dominant caste communities, but not always, who will support religious freedom in the US, but would prefer India to be or become a Hindu state. Second, we cannot ignore the place of the strong Indian Christian fundamentalist base in Christian nationalism, which complicates the relationship with Hindus further. These Indian Christian fundamentalists, both in the United States and in India, are critical of Christian persecution and Hindu nationalism in India. They want religious freedom in India. They want it to remain secular. Yet when it comes to the West, especially in the United States, for them, it is definitely a Christian nation. And Hinduism or Islam have no place in Christian America. Third, rather surprisingly, there also appears to be sympathy among Hindu nationalists towards Christian nationalists. For instance, after Trump's election, there is now a more visible support for the Christian right among the right-wing Hindus, which is very interesting. Part of it has to do with the fact that he was a successful businessman, and partly it has to do with the Christian nationalist attitude towards Islam, Islamophobia. The seeming budding friendship between Trump and Modi was celebrated by Indian Hindus. But also, as a side note, it is worth acknowledging that Indian Christians believe that Trump, who was a good Christian, has been misled by Hindu nationalists. Finally, Christian fundamentalists also turn a friendly eye towards the Hindu right. For instance, there is growing support for condemnation of academics who speak against caste discrimination or acknowledge the Hindu connections to casteism. A good example is the recent Georgia bill, the state of Georgia, that condemns Hindu hate that was passed with the support of Christian conservatives. Here, the common enemy for Christian conservatives and Hindu conservatives is the liberal academia that speaks openly about oppression and problems in religious traditions. Now, turning to Dalits and Dalit Christianity, they have been caught in the storm of Hindu nationalism from at least the beginning of the 20th century. One of the main issues is about conversions, especially to Christianity. While conversions are contentious in themselves, when Dalits convert, it is considered to be a case of allurement rather than a spiritual choice. And that seems to be a continuing issue. Dalit Christians are also denied reservations in education and employment in public sectors. Many non-Christian Dalit leaders like Thol Thirumavalavan in Tamil Nadu have been vocal supporters for Dalit Christians, alleging that this is another way of coercing the Dalits who want to seek liberation to stay within the fold of caste sanctioning Hinduism. Dalit activists and leaders also generally support Christian mission work. However, things become complicated when communities embody more than one religious identity. This happens in two ways. First, as scholars like Anderson Jeremiah have noted, Dalit Christians have always drawn from their home traditions, which are now a part of Hinduism. In my own research, I have noted that rural Dalit Christians are able to move across religious communities with ease, and often what they say and practice with respect to the religious affiliation may not match. In other words, we are able to notice a confusing and multi-layered identity among Dalit Christians in villages. Of course, this earns the wrath both from the Christian side and the Hindu side. Second, many new Dalit converts to Christianity still retain their Hindu identity on official records. This means that Dalits who may identify themselves as Christians to their own communities may actually be still Hindus in the eyes of the state. And finally, to add to these 2 points, we also cannot ignore the complexity of Dalit agency and Dalit identity. That is, how Dalits see themselves has changed since India's independence. There are many Dalits who do not want to be identified as Dalits or are uncomfortable with being identified with others who are oppressed. There are also increasingly cases of Dalits supporting Hindu nationalism. In a way, the ascent of Hindu fundamentalist political power over the last 3 decades would not have been possible without the support of Dalits, clearly. The point is that while on the one hand, Dalits are victims of Hindutva and Hindu nationalist ideology, on the other hand, they are also active agents and supporters of that ideology, which we cannot ignore. So now I move on to the second part of my paper, having given a background of sort of a very brief background, of course, of nationalism and Hindu fundamentalism in the Indian context, particularly focusing on Dalits. Now turning to Christian mission, and particularly in relation to nationalism, we have to note that Christian mission from the beginning has always intersected and wrestled with power dynamics. As it evolved from being a small, vulnerable community to a wealthy institution, the ecclesiastical structures became obsessed over power and control over others. As we know too well, this is particularly evident in the colonial and post-colonial periods of history, turning mission a suspicious enterprise. Broadly speaking, we can identify 4 areas where missions sort of serves ungodly objectives. First, Christian mission work was closely intertwined with colonial conquest. While the mission agencies and missionaries themselves may not have been directly involved or were not interested in colonial expansion as such, at least, let's say, quite a few of them, they cannot be completely, given a clean chit, so to speak. We cannot say, as Anglican scholars like Titus Pressler have claimed, that the church and mission bodies found themselves, completely, they had nothing to do with colonial expansion. In many cases, they did end up, furthering the aims of the empires, the colonizing nations. Second, we know too well that Christian mission acted as a civilizing project. Of course, civilizing continues to be seen as empowering by some scholars who write about marginalized communities like Dalits. So it is seen as something positive. For example, Christian missions were responsible for providing education to many marginalized communities like Dalits. But again, we also know from the works of scholars like Rupa Vishwanath that the efforts to educate Dalits by missionaries, with few exceptions, was actually a way of making them acceptable servants in the caste and colonial structures. In other words, they were sort of tailor-made. They were shaped to fit into the hierarchical structures, not just the caste structure, but also what she calls as the trans-global racial structures. Thirdly, Christian mission in general was as interested in establishing not just Christian, but also Western supremacy. That is, the common mission approach towards other religious traditions was, in most cases, exclusivist, or at best, inclusivist. In other words, uh, Christian missionaries in general, or almost entirely, for the most part, believe that other religious traditions, the other religious faiths were inferior to Christianity. So they were there, to use the words of Paul Nitter, to replace the other religious traditions, to establish supremacy over other religious traditions. And in some cases, they could be considered as playing a fulfilling role for Christianity. Like, for example, Hinduism plays a fulfilling role. It plays the role of catering to Christianity, or serving Christianity, bringing people to Christianity. But again, finally, they definitely have to come to the Christian fold in order to be saved. So this was something, this was a common approach. Finally, mission was also responsible for shaping religious and social categories in the colonial context. That is, how we understand religious traditions and social practices were shaped by mission workers. For example, Jeff Oddy shows how missionaries played a crucial role in constructing Hinduism as one umbrella religious tradition, as one umbrella religion in modernity. So how the missionaries saw the Hindu traditions, how they understood it, how they described it, how they wrote about it, and how they taught about it to their colleagues, made a difference in shaping Hinduism, the Hinduism that we see today. So in many ways, missionaries and Christian missions had a role to play in sort of shaping some of the issues that we are dealing with when it comes to religious nationalism, the feeling of being threatened, and having this sort of Sanskritic Brahmin-centered Hindu religion. Some of these issues had to do, historically speaking, it had to do with the role of Christian missions in the colonial context. So, with all this troubled history of mission, what do we do? Of course, one temptation is to completely, avoid it, completely ignore it, and talk about safer things, which I think somehow I believe it did happen. For example, in the American context, the churches sort of avoided talking about mission, as some of the mission scholars have noted, historians have noted. So you just talk about the church and church structures, and just or you talk about more liberal issues and agendas. So mission is not something that you touch. It's sort of a bad word. Not to mention the other word, evangelism. So you just steer clear of it. But we know that mission continues to be foundational for the church. It is something mandatory. And I don't want to dwell much on this, but just want to say that, as we know, mission begins within divine life itself. For example, in the doctrine of Trinity, the three identities of the persons of the Trinity, as creation, redemption, and sustenance. So God reaches out to the world, reaches out within Godhead, reaches out to humanity, reaches out to this universe. So the idea of mission, the idea of sharing this divine presence with the other, sharing the love with divine love with one another, is something that's inbuilt within the idea of God, or the concept of God within the Christian tradition. And so it becomes something fundamental and foundational. So this means that mission is also the primary calling of the church, as mission theologians and scholars have reminded us repeatedly in the recent past. Mission is the first and fundamental step for the church before anything else. In other words, mission precedes the church. Missiology precedes ecclesiology. So who we are is defined by what we are called to do. So how does the church engage in mission in a religiously pluralist context? importantly, how does the church's mission shape out in the context of religious fundamentalism? Turning again to history, we may say that a dialogical model of mission is perhaps the best way forward. As many Asian theologians have pointed out, particularly Indian Christian theologians, since the 19th century, whenever the Christian community has opened itself to interreligious dialogue, new and creative possibilities of witnessing have emerged. However, I feel that we should also be careful about over-romanticizing dialogue. In one of my recent researches, I have argued that dialogue itself is not entirely free from power dynamics. Just want to quickly identify 4 issues with dialogue. One is that dialogue often fails to notice ambiguity within theologies of religions. That is, the different approaches, within the theologies of religions, such as exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, and more recently, particularism. So these approaches are not always mutually exclusive, and they don't necessarily, describe, the position of a person or a community in a particular religious tradition. So there is a lot of ambiguity in theologies of religious traditions, and dialogue does not necessarily pay attention to this. Secondly, dialogue also does not often recognize unresolved issues of historical trauma. In other words, what are some of the issues of historical trauma that communities bring to the table? For example, often Dalits and Dalit Christians have been accused of not being interested in dialogue, at least until very recently. And there is a lot of preaching that goes around. For example, you see this in Dr. Wesley Ariyaraja's book, Not Without My Neighbor. A Dalit bishop getting upset about Hindu-Christian dialogue. And so there's a lot of preaching that goes around. But I think there's a more historically trauma-sensitive dialogue that is needed. And we don't often pay attention to this. And thirdly, we also cannot ignore the hidden transcripts of the dominant and the dominated, to use the words of James Scott. In other words, all that is discussed in dialogue, all that a person or persons bring to the dialogue table is not authentic. It's not true. In other words, people can say one thing at the dialogue table. They can be all for, peaceful coexistence. They can be all for, equality and justice. And then they walk out of the table and they still kind of, maybe consciously or unconsciously, they continue to practice, the structures of injustice, embody them. So this is something that we also need to pay attention to, the hidden transcripts in the dialogue table, at the dialogue table. And finally, in dialogue and beyond, solidarities, that is often the catchword today in dialogue, really interreligious dialogue. Even if it is for justice, they're not entirely innocent. In other words, they're not free from the clutches of capitalism, for instance. Again, it depends on who has more power, who has more political mileage, and this is something I've come across in the United States context. So who's at the dialogue table, and who gets to speak, and when they speak, and how they speak, is always very interesting. And that is something that's sort of doctored, that sort of control in many ways. So while interreligious dialogue is promising, there are also issues that we need to continue to struggle with and acknowledge. And finally, so let me move on to the final section, a sacramental theology of mission from the margins. Dr. Peniel, do I have like a few more minutes? I hope I'm not overshooting my time. Okay. I think, a few more minutes. So keeping these issues in mind, I think it is helpful to turn to and learn from the margins. Again, of course, this doesn't mean that margins are all innocent. We already saw that the multi-layered and unpredictable nature of marginalized communities, including Dalits. Nonetheless, focusing on Dalit Christianity, I want to suggest that in contrast to conventional and popular church planting and liberationist models of mission, that are popularized and glorified in global Christianity, Christian mission can be reconceived as a vulnerable third space, which foregrounds eco-human flourishing within the matrices of injustice through subtle and seemingly non-political strategies, and by negotiating co-creative practices with religious neighbors. Let me unpack this as I go along. I want to call it a sacramental theology of mission, And to make it more discernible, I want to identify 3 moments of mission. First, a word about the Sacramental Theology of Mission. Again, I'm going to be brief here because I want to engage more in conversation. So by sacramental, I mean that mission is a reflection and expression of the presence of God in the world in diverse and even mysterious ways. It is an example and embodiment of incarnation. But within the story of the incarnation, we can note 3 key moments in the work of Christ, namely the cross, resurrection, and ascension. Of course, this is not to overlook the other aspects of Jesus' life or mission and ministry. But my point is that these 3 moments helpfully capture the sacramental nature of Jesus' mission. Firstly, there is the moment of the cross. The cross reminds us of vulnerability, as we know. While cross can be interpreted as a symbol of victory and even conquest, as it was later done, in reality, it was always a symbol of failure. And we know this, from our, studies of the Roman context, and thanks to empire critical scholarship and post-colonial scholarship. So the cross was actually a symbol of failure, at least from the perspective of the oppressed. It was a statement that, this person has failed, or this community has failed to challenge the power of the empire, the Roman Empire. So in that sense, Jesus being crucified meant that he failed. So Jesus was actually a failed rebel. This is to suggest that mission is and always should be vulnerable. It is a space of failed attempts and even failures, or at least seeming failures. A sacramental mission that is grounded at the cross of Christ remains open to be crushed by forces of religious nationalism. In other words, it's not simply about success. It's more than about numbers. It's more than about achievements. It's more than about establishing community outreach, which somewhat seems to be the catchword in Western Christianity. I've been realizing the last 4 or 5 years. The Anglican churches, Episcopal churches have been excited about the word mission. And suddenly, anybody who comes in from the global south, including me, no questions asked, you are forced to be a missioner. So you go out and bring South Asians in. You go out and you bring, Koreans in. You bring so it's like, we have been sleeping all this time, and suddenly you come and you have to bring people into the churches. You need to fill up our pews. You need to do community outreach. So this is something very interesting that's been going on. I've been seeing at least the last 5-6 years in the United States. And but my point is that a mission that is grounded at the cross of Jesus is something that's in some sense not destined, but that is open to failure. That is not about church planting. It's not about church building in some sense. It is about being the sacramental presence of God in the world, however that is meant to be. So, however the church is called to be. It's not simply about making a difference in the world, as Henry Nouwen says in his book. He argues that the calling for Christian discipleship is not about achievements. It's not about getting stuff done, but it's about faithfulness. So, which means that mission is actually rooted in a failed story, in the story of a failed rebel, so to speak. Secondly, mission in Christ's way is also open to the possibilities of resurrection. Again, as we know, resurrection symbolizes the emergence of new possibilities of existence beyond the known and the familiar. It breaks conventional and accepted understanding of life. Life as we know it, life as human beings know it. So resurrection kind of evades the temptation to reason and find proofs of existence, which is why it's in some sense not possible to prove resurrection, to demonstrate the authenticity of resurrection. It's more a faith experience. But what we also see in resurrection is the space for co-creativity with none other than God. Christopher de Reising identifies this as Concursor's Day. De Reising asserts that this is the new paradigm for mission. We become co-creators with God, co-workers with God. We don't uncritically accept the mission of God, but we Missio Dei, but we become we work with God. to create new possibilities, to imagine new possibilities. Again, going back to the resurrection, the communities had much to do with the narratives, resurrection narratives, and constructing and shaping resurrection narratives as much as, well, Jesus did, I'm sure. So in mission, this means that experiencing the fullness of divine life happens beyond conventional ways. In that sense, mission spaces become in between third spaces. They kind of evade the binary. It evades, it avoids and bypasses, easy compartmentalization or easy ways to describe or define how God acts in the world, God's works in the world. So sacramental mission spaces need not be Christian, even in the conventional sense, but dynamic, multi-religious spaces that challenge the polarizing tendencies of religious nationalism. Finally, the ascension moment in mission. Ascension, as we know, symbolizes the visible reunion of the life of Jesus within the vastness of divine life. In a way, it signifies how life remains situated or grounded in God beyond this earthly life, Jesus as incarnate in this world. So turning to process theology, as process theologians like Monica Coleman have taught us, we, like our ancestors, live on within divine life, within divine existence, beyond this earthly life. But within the larger scheme of things, we know that this is not just about human beings. Our existence as human beings is closely related with that of this planet and the universe itself. So in that sense, mission could and should be understood as abundant eco-human flourishing in and within divine existence. We and all that exists are knit together, to use the words of Raymond Panikkar, in a cosmotheandric existence. To recognize the sacramental nature of the cosmos, I believe, is a calling in mission. Together with the cosmotheandric ancestors and neighbors, in and through mission, we work for a world of justice. We work for change. We work to ensure eco-human well-being, a state when God would reign, sharing in the divine life. To use the words of Nigerian-American theologian Simon Mary Hayokai, and I'll finish with this. This is the eschatological mission of the New Testament. He says, the realization of a divinized humanity, one that is radically defined and connected with all that God shall usher into the new era of existence for all of God's creatures, end quote. Our divine eco-human ancestors and neighbors, drawn from and into the ultimate divine life, the ground of being itself, offer us new opportunities and possibilities to live in peace with one another, our land, and our planet. Thank you.